several years ago, I was meeting with some Chinese communists, sorry about that. And we were having a discussion, and they were talking about how their government could be fast and efficient. And I said, that's horrible. I don't want a government that is fast and efficient. And sometimes you hear people talk about gridlock. In the U.S. Constitution, gridlock is a feature, not a bug.
Senator, although I should say tonight, Professor, could you come and tell us why we ought to celebrate the 250th birthday of this great country and why we should love the Constitution the way you surely do? Senator Ted Cruz.
Well, thank you very, very much. Let me first of all say congratulations. Wow. 100 million bucks? Listen, let me say to everyone here, congratulations. Congratulations on what y'all are doing here at the University of Austin. This matters. This is important. Look, higher education, I think, in America is broken. Higher education at far too many institutions across this country has lost its vision. And too many colleges and universities think their mission is to indoctrinate young people with one point of view and to make them terrified of any contrary facts, any contrary view, and in fact to raise little delicate sunflowers who cannot encounter opposition. I can think of few things more corrupting to education than that. And the University of Austin is designed to be a place to develop your mind, to challenge what you're thinking, to teach you, to learn from great thinkers throughout the ages, and then to put you in a position to be the next great thinker in the next age. That is profoundly needed. Now, I want to tell the young people also here, you can overcome any impediment. You can overcome any obstacle, and I'm going to point as an object lesson to this, Becca Schwinger. So Becca, who works here at the University of Austin, who's blushing because she knows exactly where this is going, Becca and I were in junior high together. I was in 8th grade. She was in 7th grade. Becca and I were in The Sound of Music together. I played Rolf, and she played Liesel. So, with me as a pimply-faced 13-year-old, on stage, I warbled out, "You are 16, going on 17." Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I cannot carry a tune. I believe in the entire song, I did not hit one note. And she sat there, gazing adoringly. It's acting. She's a very good actress. And then actually at the end of the scene, I'm embarrassed to say, I kissed her. And her husband, Scott, who's 6'4", has not slugged me once. But Becca endured my horrible singing for 3 performances, and she's gone on to have an incredible career and has overcome that adversity, so you could overcome anything. So a couple of months ago, 75 new students arrived here at the University of Austin. That doubled the number of students to 150. Now, what can 75 people do? What can 150 people do? 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. 189 men are recorded as having been killed in the Alamo. It only takes a handful of courageous revolutionaries to change the world. You know, at the Alamo, I'm reminded of a story from years back in the 1980s. 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president. And Phil Graham was a Texas congressman. At the time, he was a conservative Democrat, at a time when conservative Democrats existed. And Phil Graham, as a conservative Democrat, was shepherding through Ronald Reagan's tax cut. And he was meeting with the fellow conservative Democrats from Texas and trying to convince other Democrats we ought to cut taxes. And Phil said, this is a moment like when William Barrett Travis drew a line in the sand in the Alamo. And he said to his fellow Texas congressmen, this is your choice to step across that line or not. And one of them said, Phil, everybody who stepped across that line, they died. And without missing a beat, Phil said, yes, they did. And everybody who didn't step across that line, they died too. But nobody remembers their names. What can 75 people do? What can 150 people do? Change the entire world. Now, 250 years ago, next July 4th, those 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. When they signed it, they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors. Now, understand, this was a different act than posting something on Instagram. This was committing treason. They were declaring to the monarch, the King of England, we are in open rebellion. And those words, we pledge our lives, fortune, and sacred honor, those weren't empty words. With an act of treason, they were quite literally putting their own lives and their families' lives and everything they had worked for at risk. A couple of months ago, we had a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we were considering the nomination of several appointees to the State Department, one of whom in his written testimony had written that our rights do not come from government, they come from God. And I will say one of my colleagues, Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, when it was his time to question, he challenged the nominee on that statement. He said, you said in your testimony, our rights don't come from government, they come from God. He said, that is a radical statement. That is an extreme statement. That is a dangerous statement. He said, that's the kind of theocratic extremism that nations like Iran are based on, not America. We don't believe that here. Now, I was literally walking into the hearing as Tim was saying this. I almost fell over. And I got a chance to question shortly thereafter, and I had a whole series of questions I was planning to ask, but I changed what I was going to say. And I said, look, Tim Kaine just made the statement that the idea that our rights come from God and not from government is radical and extreme and dangerous. And I said, in a sense, he's right. But it is also literally the founding principle upon which the United States of America was created. And I said at the hearing, if you don't believe me, maybe you will believe another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, who in the Declaration penned these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now stop, self-evident, so obvious that any imbecile could figure it out. That all men are created equal. And that they are endowed by their Creator. Not by government, not by the DNC or the RNC, but by God Almighty, with certain unalienable rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was extraordinary and revolutionary. That was in 1776. Fast forward to 1787. And after difficult years, failed years under the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution was drafted. The Constitution, likewise, was a radical document. It was a radical document because it built on what the Declaration has said. What does it mean that our rights come from God? For most of history, people had believed that monarchs, kings and queens and emperors get their power from God, and that sovereignty flows down from the monarch, from God to the monarch, and then the monarch governs the people. And under that view of things, rights are things to be given like crumbs from the table of the monarch. But if government is giving you your rights, it means government can take your rights. And it also means the only source of legitimacy for any right you might claim to have is whatever the current law might be. When I was in that Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, I pointed out, I said, look, under that line of thinking, for the first 100 years of our nation's history, 100 plus, when slavery was legal, under that reasoning, there was nothing wrong with it. Because if rights don't come from God, under the law, slavery was legal, so clearly it must be okay. Except it wasn't. Slavery is wrong and grotesque and evil and immoral, and it was wrong when the law allowed it, and it's wrong when we banned it, and we fought a bloody civil war to end it. And the reason it is wrong is because our rights come from God Almighty, and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not something government has the power to take away. The Constitution inverted the model of sovereignty. And instead of viewing sovereignty as something that originates from God, goes down to the monarch and the government, and then goes to the people, instead, it turns it upside down, and it begins with the opening words of the Constitution, we the people. It is the people who come together to form a government and to lend that government authority. The sovereignty remains with the people. And authority is lent for a period of time. But the purpose of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson referred to the Constitution as chains to bind the mischief of government. You look at the Constitution that came together. I believe it is the greatest document authored by mortal hands in the history of mankind. The Constitution inverted sovereignty, and it did something the Supreme Court has referred to as splitting the atom of sovereignty. Now understand, the framers, we were extraordinarily blessed to have framers like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. These were men of extraordinary erudition. I'm reminded of when President JFK hosted a dinner at the White House with a table full of Nobel laureates, brilliant thinkers. And he commented, this is the greatest assemblage of minds in this building since Thomas Jefferson dined alone. But America, I believe, was truly blessed by God. It was providential. The leaders that came together to sign the Declaration, came together to write the Constitution. These were leaders of extraordinary wisdom and judgment who had to make balances, who had to make trade-offs. They were not naive. They were not foolish. They understood that man is a fallen creature. They understood that people behave according to rational incentives. Look, I think many of the most pernicious political ideas foisted upon humanity have come from this notion that humans are perfectible. You look at the very heart of socialism or communism, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. I think the framers understood human beings will behave according to their self-interest, so let's not deny it. Let's not pretend that doesn't exist. Instead, let's create systems to contain it. So splitting the atoms of sovereignty, what does that mean? They divided federal power vertically and horizontally. Vertically, they divided it with federalism between the federal government, the states, and the local governments. And they were designed to fight each other. Horizontally, they divided federal power between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And they were designed to fight each other. Several years ago, I was meeting with some Chinese communists, sorry about that. And we were having a discussion, and they were talking about how their government could be fast and efficient. And I said, that's horrible. I don't want a government that is fast and efficient. And sometimes you hear people talk about gridlock. In the U.S. Constitution, gridlock is a feature, not a bug. After the Constitution was written, there were 2 years where the nation debated, do we adopt this document? A series of newspaper editorials were written that became called the Federalist Papers. Written in New York, written under a pseudonym of Publius. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote them. I got to say, you read even one of the Federalist Papers, then you look at your local newspaper and read it, and think somehow, boy, the editorials have gone down in quality. Although I will say this, since I admitted at the outset that I played Rolf alongside Becca, I am certain the Austin American Statesman has already reported that Cruz admitted he was a Nazi. But the Federalist Papers were an extraordinary argument why we should adopt the Constitution. In Federalist 10, Madison writes about what he calls factions. Today, we'd probably call those special interests. And it accepted the notion everyone is going to behave according to their self-interest. He wasn't horrified by it. He'd read Genesis. But he said the best way to contain it is ambition must counteract ambition. And so the federal government is designed so that no one faction, no one special interest can seize control of the entirety of government. Because if any one faction can seize control of the entirety of government, they will use it to advance their own ends at the expense of everyone else. And the genius of saying, let's create different parts that are selected in different ways, that are institutionally designed to be oppositional. If we have a bunch of folks in Washington fighting each other, then at least they can't gang up together and fight all of us. That was the entire design. Now, the Constitution obviously was adopted 2 years later, 1789. And in the course of the debate over the Constitution, there was a vigorous debate about whether or not we need a Bill of Rights. The Federalists, the advocates for the Constitution, they argued we don't need a Bill of Rights. And the reason they said we don't need a Bill of Rights is they said this is not a government of general jurisdiction. And actually think of it in contradiction to the states. So the states are governments of general jurisdiction. The states have authority under the law to do anything unless it is prohibited to the states to do. Instead, the framers, one of the essential elements of the Constitution is the federal government was not a government of general jurisdiction. Rather, the federal government is a government of enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8 specifies 18 powers given to Congress and the federal government. And the framers argued if it's not in the enumerated powers, then the federal government doesn't have the power to do it. Well, the Anti-Federalists came back with vigorous arguments. We need a Bill of Rights. Government power always tends to expand. And they had an argument. Actually, my senior thesis in college went through the debates over the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. And one of the things I did is I analyzed the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists over whether we need a Bill of Rights. And my conclusion was the Anti-Federalists won. One of the arguments they made is, look, even if it remains a government of enumerated powers, the federal government could still violate our fundamental rights in the exercise of those enumerated powers. So, for example, one of the enumerated powers is to create a post office. The federal government has created a post office. If the post office suddenly decided we're only going to deliver communications, and by the way, for young people, there was a time when a post office was it. There wasn't no email, there wasn't no texting. It was write a letter or sing out your window. And if a post office suddenly says we'll only deliver letters from Republicans, or we'll only deliver letters from Democrats, or only deliver letters from Southern Baptists, that would clearly violate our rights, and yet there was nothing in the Constitution without a Bill of Rights that prohibited it. Well, the Federalists won the big argument, and the Constitution was adopted, but the Anti-Federalists won the sub-argument, and it was adopted under the understanding that we would adopt the Bill of Rights. And the first 10 amendments to the Constitution were that Bill of Rights. James Madison was the principal author of the Bill of Rights. The first two protections in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the number one protection, what they led off, the first clause of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is protecting religious liberty. Look, we were a nation that was founded by people fleeing religious oppression, coming from other countries where the government asserted the power to control what you believed and how you worshiped. And the framers believed the very first liberty any one of us has is to worship the Lord God Almighty with all of our hearts, minds, and souls. And that ultimately it is each of us in our conscience who makes the decision what that means and how to worship or whether or not to worship at all. That it is not government's business to take away that liberty. That is the first liberty ensconced and protected in the Bill of Rights, and right behind that is free speech. Free speech, again, is a radical concept. You want to understand how radical? Just take a look at Europe. Take a look at Europe, where many of the nations there do not have a tradition of free speech, do not have a fundamental protection of free speech. We're seeing in the United Kingdom right now people being arrested for sending tweets the government doesn't like. And by the way, free speech, sometimes I listen to my colleagues and they will say, well, the First Amendment doesn't protect hate speech. It doesn't protect hateful speech. It doesn't protect bad speech. And that is utter and complete nonsense. Look, you don't need a First Amendment to protect popular speech. If you say something everyone agrees with, you don't need any legal protection at all. The only purpose of the First Amendment when it comes to free speech is to protect unpopular speech, is to protect speech the majority disagrees with. And by the way, what that speech is at any given time can change. But the First Amendment protects hateful speech, it protects idiotic speech, it protects bigoted speech. The First Amendment protects Nazis and Klansmen. There we go. I've given the headline to the Statesman now. Now, to be clear, the fact that you have a legal right to spout garbage does not mean that everyone else has their moral obligation lifted to confront your garbage with truth. I think Nazis and Klansmen are ignorant, bigoted morons I think their ideas are imbecilic and dangerous. But I agree with John Stuart Mill, who said the best cure for bad speech is more speech. That rather than have the government decide, we don't like some ideas, so you don't get to say them, instead, the marketplace of ideas counters that. And that brings us right back to the University of Austin. Look, to the students here, your job as a student is not to go in and listen to your professors and agree with everything your professors teach. It is to come in and think and challenge and have an open mind to learn, but also confront yourself. Confront your own beliefs. Read things you disagree with. I went to law school at Harvard. When I was there were more communists on the faculty than there were Republicans. That's not hyperbole. There were about a dozen self-described Marxists. This is not me calling them communists. They would tell you I'm a Marxist. It's written in their bio half the time. When I was there was one open Republican on the entire faculty. Now, I went out of my way to take classes from the communists. And let me be clear, I am the son of a Cuban immigrant. My family has been imprisoned and tortured. I hate communists. But I wanted to know what they were teaching to understand it, because you can't fight something if you don't know what it is, if you don't understand it. And so I want to say, look, I am excited. All right, I hope you take some like grainy black and white pictures of your students and your faculty. Because I'm thinking of like superhero movies where you see the old grainy black and white photos of the very first gathering of the Avengers. And I'm just looking forward with excitement to where everyone is going to be in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and 50 years. Because Texas needs the University of Austin and America needs the University of Austin. And so I'll close the way I opened by saying congratulations. What y'all are doing here is important.